So, my talk about China will be primarily focused on the foreign relations, brief historical development, society, ethnic national identity and ideology and culture, current issue and current and current issues. I wrote quite a bit on this because I thought that Connor wrote a bit, so there's a lot to go through. Um, so, foreign relation wise, China has traditionally they were not very. They have always been a very trading country. They had the Silk Road and that kind of stuff. In 2017, they they started an initiative by incorporating it into their constitution, titled the Belt and Road Initiative. And the official goal of it is a bid to enhance regional connectivity and embrace a brighter future. And some countries, such as the United States, have viewed it as a threat by China to have a Sino-centric trading atmosphere so that they're the center of the trading instead of, there being multiple centers. And though I don't have it clipped here or anything, there was a chart I saw the other day and it talked about how the impact of this Sino-centric trading war has had, especially with the trade war that's gone on between America and China, which I'm going to talk about here in a bit as well. Um, the world really has become a lot more Sino-centric over the last couple of years since they initiated this and since the trade war started. Oh, and this was really interesting. In 2017, China gave a lease to a Sri Lankan was given a lease to a Sri Lankan port by the Sri Lankan government because they're unable to pay for the total because China had racked up so many debts to themselves through Sri Lanka that they just couldn't pay it. So they built them a port, and because they couldn't pay for it, China now owns the port for the next 99 years, as well as they were given a large. I don't have the exact number down. A large number of amount of land around the area, which is causing a lot of strife and struggle due to the fact that a lot of people live around that area and they don't really want to be evicted. Let me go down a little bit. All right, here's the part about the trade war. They've been engaged in a trade war since 2018. The term war is used in this instance to signify that they've been placing tariffs on one another with the end goal for the United States being for the end goal for the one who initiated it, the United States, being to end the pattern of unfair trade practices and the theft of American intellectual property rights. Um, China and America are said to be they're the two top economies in the world, which is, you know, that's a given. And then the South China dispute. I really didn't talk about all of it in this. I just kind of summed it up and talked about more recent stuff that's happened to it. It's been a constant in 1950s since in politics since 1950s. It was initiated by China when its premier Zhou Enlai issued a claim over the Parcel and Spratly Islands. Locally, it's been between Brunei, China, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam. The main problems have arisen from the main reasons of giant problems because they've discovered oil in it, and China not having a lot of oil at home is like, oh, we'll push into it. And I don't have this down, but they've been building artificial islands because legally speaking, the definition, this is the reason I lost the early dispute, for a land claim or a extension to be lawfully claimed, there has to be a island on it, and the only island that there goes to where they claim their land claim ends is not an actual island. It's a piece of land that's usually under the ground. So really, it's not even a island. It's just under the ground, under the water. It's constantly underneath the water. So a lot of experts have argued and said, that they're valid, their whole claim is invalid. But lately, they've been building all these artificial islands and stuff out there to strengthen their military, and it showed in 2018 a South Korean destroyer traveled into the area of the South China Sea on accident and was threatened by China until they left. And in 2020, late 2020, China claimed to have removed a United States destroyer that entered the area through, removed. They forced it out. Is kind of what they're saying. Then I talked about the relation that Korea has with China, South and North Korea. They have opposite relations. South Korea doesn't like China. They lost all of North Korea due to China at the end of the Korean War, and the Chinese and American forces have only came into conflict through the Korean War, when China told the United States Army that if they kept pushing north, they would attack. They kept pushing north, almost reached the China border. China said, "No, man, no way." They pushed. Initially, there was a lot of resistance by the Americans, but the Chinese used the same tactic that the Russians used during World War II, which was which was a amount of soldiers that's so large, it's just like crazy to even think about. But they all just rushed the forces at the same time. Eventually, they would, like, I've read books about it, and they talk about how they talk about how they could. It was a British point of view from it, because the British were there as well, and they were fighting as well. And from their point of view, they still remember seeing the giant, just mounds of people just rushing their comrades, and they wouldn't hear from them again. They just got to think they died. They'd see like just massive piles of bodies, and that actually made it harder for them to kill because there's just so many dead and all that kind of stuff. It's very crazy, very, very crazy. There's a mountain, the Paktu Mountain. It is on the border between China and North Korea. If you ever watch a Chinese documentary, or not Chinese, a Korean documentary, they'll usually mention the mountain and mention how the only way for South Koreans to see it is to go through China, and the only way for North Koreans always go through North Korea to see it. And it's another way. It's another stir of controversy, because a lot of Koreans, it's like they're so my last video broke, so we're going to continue on from here, from the brief historical divide. Oh yeah, this is the very end of foreign relations. To the east of China lies one of its greatest former enemies, Japan. Prior to World War II, Japan, at the command of its god Emperor Hiroto, invaded western China and found itself invading into a civil war between nationalist and communist. The Japanese held a lot of China until 1945, when it surrendered to the United States. Previously, before they surrendered, the Chinese forces had actually, recently, it was now a mix of Chinese and Russian, and they were all starting to really condense on the Japanese forces, and they were forcing them out anyways. The surrender just really hastened their retreat. There was a survey conducted in 2014 where they asked different people around the country what they thought about other nations, if they liked it, if they disliked it, if they were indifferent. 3% of Japanese people said that they liked China. 73% stated a dislike for China, and 5% of Chinese admitted to liking China, but 90% admitted to disliking it. And I want to say, in America, that's not really American. In America, it was about, I'm probably going to mess this up, 60%. They were majority disliked. China was, and a lot of people liked Japan. America was actually not very much liked worldwide, which was kind of crazy to me. I think China was more liked, which is, ooh. Okay, so history. Traditionally, China has divided its history into dynasties, with the leader's clan's name being the namesake for each dynasty. The first dynasty was the Xia dynasty, which existed from 2100 to 1600 BC. The total amount of dynasties is conflicted, with many short ones being intermixed with large, expansive ones. The last dynasty in China was the Qing dynasty, which went on for 276 years, from 1636 to 1912. In 1912, the Republic of China was founded after the 1911 Revolution. And at a time coexisted within it. At a time coexisted with the modern China, with modern day China, until for reasons you're about to find out. So after the end of the dynasty, China experienced a civil war. It was between the forces of the Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. It was brought on because of the split, because of where they wanted the government split on where they wanted the capital to be, because one group wanted it. I want to say the communists wanted it to be more to the north in Wuhan, north. I want to say northwest. They want to be northwest near Wuhan so that they'd have a more close connection to Russia, and the non-communist party wanted it to be more east, away from the outside influences, so they could focus more on internal development and that type of stuff. And it was known for, near the beginning, and on April of 1927, there's an incident which really ignited the flames to the fire, and it was the Shanghai Massacre, which saw anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 communist sympathizers killed. And they were mostly workers, just common everyday man. They weren't political opponents or anything, just people that identify as communists. So after the Republic of China lost to the Communist Party, they temporarily signed a truce during World War II, where they combined their forces to fight the Americans, but not Americans, just Japanese. But after that, they once again did not like each other, and they split apart. The remnant of Republic of China is going to be Taiwan. That's where they ended up at, and that's why Taiwan is such a hot pot for Chinese issues currently, though it's not talked about on current issues. So after taking over the Republic of China from the Communist Party, after the Communist Party took over the Republic of China, the work of a new government was built on communist principles, naming itself the People's Republic of China. One of the very first controversies in its history, it's one of the major first occurrences, was the Chinese Land Reform Act, movement. They had several of these, but each time it occurred, it was an attempt at redistributing the land to the peasant, and it was done through violent means of killing their oppressive, not always, but usually landowners. And it was found that it's scarily contrasts to the American Salem witch trials, and that towards the end they have found that a lot of places already had a method of no landowners, just the people working their own land and stuff like that. So they just started to kill random people, because they're like, everyone has to participate. Mao, who was the leader of the Communist Party at this time, he was all about trying to get everyone on board with it, everyone to participate, everyone to be active and stuff like that. And it's estimated that 1 to 4 million people were killed during that time. After all that's when the Korean War occurred, and that was the first battle that was the thing China did during that war, was that they used a force called the People's Volunteer Force to make it seem like they're just volunteers, but it came out later that a majority of the force was manned by very veteran fighters from the Chinese conflicts previously. And there's the fact that they had to overwhelm the UN. It was a United Nations force. They had to overwhelm the force through numbers. So it it really did not improve their looking that well. Um, After that was probably one of the darkest points of modern Chinese history, and that was the Great Famine. It was supposed to be the Great Leap Forward, and it consisted of their leader Mao putting peasants into compounds so that they would be able to maximize their output. But it was done on poor principles because they bought the price of rice went down because there's so much of it. They sold it for more, but the people weren't richer. The people were only getting poorer. They developed what's it called? They developed backstock. I'll say they developed backstock, and they had a lot of stuff just in case anything happened. But a locust swarm came and ate up 99% of the food, and it led to a massive famine that occurred from 1959 to 1969 with an estimated death toll of around 30 million. And it, including failed pregnancies, it would be around 60 million. And it was marked, and it was they utilized the method until 3 years after Mao's death in 1979. And then the next, I realize a lot of this stuff I'm talking about is it's not the best to talk about, but um, now this next one is I'm going to be I have a couple paragraphs dedicated to the Tiananmen Square massacre, and it's a dark stain on the People's Republic of China, with the imagery that has with talk of it and imagery of it being banned from China. You can't post it at all. I've been on services that had a Chinese influence on them. I can't remember the names of them or anything, but I would have instances where I may say Tiananmen Square, where, something like that, and I wouldn't even realize it was owned by China or anything. But just like that, I'm gone. They take that stuff very seriously. If a company wants to intertwine with the Chinese market, they will forbid all the words that will trigger the censors of China. The protest, okay, so the Tiananmen Square protest was mostly peaceful, and it was due to the fact that a political leader he wasn't a leader, he was a political, he had a position in the government, and he'd recently been forced to resign due to his pro-freedom and pro-democracy views. His name was Hu Yaobang. And after he'd been removed from his position, he suffered a heart attack, and a lot of students felt as if that he only died because he was removed from his position. So during his funeral, there was 300,000 students, and they mostly dispersed. But over time, there's there's still a lot of them just kind of circling around, and on June 1st, 1989, the leader of China, Premier Li Peng, he started to circulate a report that was looking to gain the support of his comrades to clear the square, calling the protesters who had been in it thus far terrorists and counter-revolutionaries, because after the funeral, because they felt that that Hu Yaobang had been disrespected, they had a little riot that died down a bit afterwards. It's just a kind of deal, and he used this to say that they should kick him out and they should use violence. And he also said that Americans were behind the corruption of the youth, and that it was just a massive political campaign by the Americans. And the first stages of the massacre started when the state-owned newspapers started to release articles pushing for the ideology that these students were bad and that they should all leave the square. And on June 3rd, the day before the massacre started, students found soldiers smuggling weapons into the city, and they handed the weapons and soldiers over to the police. And then at 10 p.m. on June 3rd, the massacre started. The 30th Army started pushing into the city with the arms which they had. Up to this point, the many different armed forces, mainly consisting of giant, large vehicles, had attempted to push into the Tiananmen Square. They were in Beijing. They attempted to push into the city, but each time they were repelled by different groups. Mostly, it was just people just standing there, not letting them pass. It was all peaceful. They've been very, on that because they didn't want conflict. But this time, the 30th Army, as they had many times before, attempted to start going to the town. But instead of, when they were repelled, instead of backing away, they merely started shooting. And the first student died at 10 p.m. on June 3rd. His name, I don't have his name down. But as they started pushing into the town, they kept firing and firing. And they met several roadblocks. And each time students might pelt them with rocks or something, but in their response, they would shoot them. And at one time, there was a bridge that was covered with buses that had been lit aflame by more violent protesters that had seek to stop their pursuit forward. And when a group of nearby residents from apartment complexes came out to heckle the soldiers who had been stopped, and they were massacred. They were killed. Let me go down a little bit. And then as the army neared the square, they met more and more battle-ready and violent protesters, with some of them wielding sticks, cocktails, Molotov cocktails, and rocks, with some even killing a few soldiers through beating them to death. And then on June 5th, 2 days later, they made it to the square, and a infamous picture came, and that is the tank man of the man standing in front of the square. And yeah, when he talked for a lot. All right. So the tank man imagery came from June 5th, and it's the image that most people consist of it. It consists of a man. There's a video of it, and it's just the man standing there until eventually a group of pedestrians that all look like they're protesters, they all come up next to him. They grab him and take him away, and no one knows what happened to him. There's people that say he was killed immediately. People say that he's hiding. It's a controversial subject on what occurred to him. Still in historical development, their current leader is Xi Jinping, and he's been in office since 2012, and his time in office has marked some of the heaviest censorship that's existed thus far in China. And many people around the world, such as former Vice President Pence, have called China a surveillance state due to its highly controlling nature. And it is one of the last communist countries in the world from the days of the Cold War. Its closest ally is not even someone that it really trusts nowadays, and that is North Korea. Earlier I talked about if you ever see a documentary about China and North Korea, they talk about the Paktu Mountains. Well, that's also been like a source of controversy, that whole area, because when Kim Jong-il took office and Kim Jong-un took office from his father, he had an uncle who was very pro-China, and he had the uncle killed. And many Chinese saw this as I don't have this in the deal. They saw this as a want to disconnect with China. So when I watched the documentary I watched, it showed that there were many bridges that were complete, bridges that had been stopped, and all kinds of tensions that had raised on the border between China and North Korea. And, I watched a documentary that was later, that was after the trade resumed, and it was all about how secretive they are on what they trade. No one really knows, but people have realized over the years that the primary output from North Korea that goes into China is labor. And there are along the border brothels manned by North Korean citizens that come there to make money out of North Korea legally. And it is a major path of, it, the border is a major path for defectors to try to cross, but the Chinese try to deflect them just as badly as the North Koreans try to keep them. So it's a bit of a hard cross. Let me go down. All right, so I'll talk about society now. As I talked about before, they are heavily censored. Can't talk about Winnie the Pooh, as some citizens formally compared Xi Jinping to Winnie the Pooh, and it caused some conflicts. They have their own social media platform, Weibo, and it's state controlled and monitored. They have a system called the social credit system, which involves them constantly tracking their citizens online, physically through cameras and that type of stuff. And it gives them a score based on what they do and what happens, with people below certain scores, being watched more carefully. And they have some of the best face recognition software in the world. And so let me go down. Then I talked about that. There's a man named Blitz Chung, who, in a current issue that I don't talk about, he spoke out in support of, he was a professional video game player of the video game Hearthstone, which is a card game, online card game. And he owned by Blizzard, Activision Blizzard. And the company has a 10% stake in it from Tencent, which is a state-owned Chinese gaming company, it has bought into a lot of the world's video game franchises, with many not being untouched. And it has led to a lot of drama in the video game world. But Blitz Chung, he spoke out in support of the Hong Kong protest and was banned from. He was a professional player, and he was banned from participation in a tournament, along with two different hosts of the tournament who had been, the people talking, who had also made pro Hong Kong remarks, and they were banned from ever doing it again. And many American politicians demand they talk to Blizzard, which has its headquarters in America. They said, this is crazy, free speech. And they said, okay. So all they did was shorten his sentence to like half a year. That was it. They didn't even get rid of the sentence. It's crazy. And then I have a pun that I really liked. Or it's not a pun, but it's a little section. China has a gambling problem. And no, I didn't misspell gambling. China, in 2019, they had to set guidelines for their younger gamers because they found that so many other gamers were, younger people were playing games that it was just taking up all their time. So now they have like hard limits on how much they can spend and how much money and time they can spend on the games. And it doesn't take much searching to find, the many stories of Chinese gamers being found dead just while they were playing games. They just happened to pass away due to different reasons. Players took to Reddit. And at one point, there's one game, it's also owned by Activision Blizzard, which has a 10% ownership from Tencent. And there's this game called World of Warcraft. You may have heard of it. It's very old. It's a classic online role-playing game. Massively online role-playing game. And in America, it's very heavily, a lot of rules that you have to follow. And you can't advertise illegal out-of-game services and that type of stuff. But the version of it that's in China, which is where the game has several million people playing it, and subscribe to it, which you have to pay like $10 a month to be subscribed, or $15, I want to say it is. In China, they gave the rights of it to a Chinese-owned agency, which is pretty much made it so that it's just an open playing field for whatever you want to do. You can do. There's not really any regulation and rules. I mean, people have found that it's surprisingly contrast to the way that the Chinese government takes on things. And on Reddit, the social media platform, a group of Chinese Redditors came and said, please help us save WoW. And it was a plea for help due to the fact that it's such a wasteland, mainly to do with in-game advertisements for different services and such. And then this part is one that I know a lot about, but that's why I started with this is Braden just coming to speak about this. So in Asia, they have a lot of each nation of South Korea, Japan, and North Korea, China have their own comic style. South Korea being webcomic, Japan being manga, and China being manhua. And I personally, one thing that I gotta point out about Chinese comics, manhwas, as they're called, is that they are heavily censored as what they can and cannot talk about. You don't realize in the writing, but they can't talk about anything modern. They can only talk about older stuff. They can't allude to any modern countries, nations, groups. One of my favorite ones out of China, it's called the Scholar's Reincarnation. It's very loosely China. You can tell they're in China, but that's where the similarities to modern day, and there are no characters. It's fully colored. There are no characters of any nationality besides Chinese in it. Yeah, there's no characters besides Chinese, and I gotta say, stuff I've noticed from reading the comics, they usually make their skin very white, especially the women. The women have very pale skin, and the men have very tan skin, I'd like to say. And a common theme in their comics is the topic of reincarnation, with a lot of their comics, manhwas being about reincarnation and people who passed away, and now they're trying to restart their life as a better person. And then we have two more sections: the current issues and ethnic and national identity, ideology, and culture, which I'll be talking about now. So, China is made up of a variety of different ethnicities. Majority of people in China belong to the Han ethnicity. There are 56 different ethnicities in China, and most of them pertain to only certain areas within China, except for the Han, who live pretty much all over China. China has had to deal with problems pertaining to issues between ethnic groups. The Chinese culture is vast and of utmost importance to many people that reside in China. One thing that I should have brought up in current issues, but I brought up here, is the Christian. That is just to point out how. Sorry, I actually do bring it up later, so I'll just say this here. Christianity initially came to China in the mid-1900s after World War II, and at the time, I read that there's a saying by the Chinese in China that they felt that their culture was such a large part, their non-religious culture. They have religion, but it's not. The state doesn't allow religion in China, or didn't during the mid 1950s. They disallowed it. I'll talk about that more in current issues. But they said that every new Christian was one less Chinese. I thought that was interesting. The Chinese ideology for the last 70 years or so has been dominated by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, and it is pretty much mandatory for all citizens of China to at least be members in some regard. And in China, they don't own. It has such a large influence. They don't own any of their land. That they're built so heavily on the communist ideology that all land is loaned by state, with they themselves merely owning the buildings which resides on the land. So if the state ever needs to do anything to the land, they can just say, get out of the way. we own this land. China, more modern, China has pushed heavily for communist communist related items to be put in churches so that the members can see it. And a story I saw that kind of made me laugh was they wanted a picture of Xi Jinping to be put next to the cross in one church. In the past year, he got away with not having to do it due to the fact that he alluded to that it would compare him to Jesus. It would compare Xi Jinping to a criminal that had sat next to Jesus on another cross, and it'd be alluding to the fact that he was a criminal if he had it up. The Chinese culture is one of the oldest in the world, and Chinese culture is everywhere. If you think about it, you don't have to watch very many movies to see someone going to go get Chinese food. Someone, wearing Chinese attire. The classic, I don't know how to describe it, just the classic attire of the Chinese population. Chinese food, it's everywhere. In Abilene, I have written here, in Abilene alone, we have 11 restaurants that primarily serve Chinese food. And in Sweetwater, which is to the west of Abilene, they have a place called, I can't remember what it's called. It's just like China Buffet, but it's been there for forever now. My grandparents went to before I was even born. Like 1980s or so, and it's been there forever. And it's always been owned, but Chinese owned, which is really interesting for such a small town. So, current issues. China currently has a lot of issues abroad and at home, with one issue that's also related to their ethnicities, being the genocide of the Uyghur population through camps and forced sterilization. They have put up all these camps, and you can see photos of the camps quickly being built that they have housed Uyghurs in, and through a document that was not meant to be released, document that was not released, it's talked about on page 6, 5,169 words in, that it says that the document that was leaked from China, it was they're sending it through their stuff, it is shown that the re-education camps are actually high security prisons with strict discipline and punishments. And the reason why China has felt the need to push these people into these camps and sterilize them is that the Uyghurs are they go against them in a couple ways, with their religion being such a large, they're Islamic, Muslim, and to them a religion is a big part of their identity, and a lot of Chinese Communist Party involves the exclusion of religion from there, with China being the main ideology and Christianity, everything, being put out. They don't want those ideologies in their way. And alone in 2009, 200 Uyghurs were killed in clashes with the government linked to violent protests. So, more recently, religion as a whole has started to make a comeback in China. In 1976, there was a ban after the after 1950s until 1976 on religion in China, and in 1976 there was a slight, but the ban was slightly lifted, and a mass of Christian missionaries flooded into China per se. But in 2018, Xi Jinping, the premier, has started to introduce regulations for religion operating within China, limiting their services to only certain areas, state-approved areas, and he's actually Protestant Protestantism is such a big part of the Christianity in China that they've had to release certain articles of regulations just for Christianity, which is crazy. They have to have imagery of people. They don't allow Protestants to gather multiple churches into one venue. They have to have their own individual churches. This has occurred once within the last couple of years, where a couple of churches got together, and the primary pastor was arrested and is still in prison today. I have it right. I don't have the date of his arrest, so I can't say. But Wang Yi was arrested and sentenced to 9 years in prison when he set up a large group of churches, and he called Xi Jinping a sinner, and that's what got him arrested. All right, here's the talk about Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has been a very major it's been, everywhere. It really started to gain ground internationally in America probably, but internationally it's been around for a while. But nationally, America, the problem Hong Kong really started to gain ground when the NBA he's either general manager or club owner, but his name was Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, which is a team with a massive amount of support in China. He tweeted out in support of Hong Kong, and they found their games all instantly being banned on Chinese television. Several days later, the basketball player LeBron James made an infamous insight about how Morey had needed to do his research before coming to the defense of the Hong Kong, and he was immediately heavily criticized by everyone in America for his remarks and support of China for the Hong Kong protests. And the Hong Kong protests are about how there's been an attempt in Hong Kong, which is it identifies as a separate area from China, so it doesn't have to deal with the regulations as much as mainland China. And there's a bill that they attempted to pass that would have allowed China to just, grab anybody they wanted. If they wanted someone, they would have done it without any paperwork or anything. And everyone was like, no, man, it's not cool. We lose all our freedoms if we do this. So they started to put up roadblocks and protesting everywhere. You can find videos of the roadblocks and all that stuff. Like that video I saw other protesters, it's them all just kind of hanging out with masks on and stuff like that. They were wearing heavy gas masks because they had a lot of gas agents that were being deployed in attempts to disperse them, as well as live ammunition at sometimes. But the media, once all this stuff happened in America, they swarmed to Hong Kong and they started to heavily record everything that was going on in Hong Kong. So it's pretty much all I have to say about Hong Kong, about China. China's a very turbulent place. A long time ago, it was a very nice place. They initiated the Silk Road, but more recently they've become more and more closeted, I guess you could say. They have been very much pushing outward to grab a lot of the national they have been pushing really hard to grab a lot of national interest. I can point you to a million shows on channels like Discovery that have to do with like logging in Brazil, and they'll be talking about how heavily there's Brazilian logging, Chinese logging companies in Brazil, state-owned, where they'll just be out there and they'll have guns and they have to worry about them killing them and stuff. I can't remember the show. I just remember watching it forever ago, and it was one of the things they talked about in the show. So sorry, but I thought that was very interesting, and I hope you found this interesting as well. If you ever want to hear more about China, just ask, man. I'll tell you. I love China. I love China. I love to talk about China. All right, that's it. Bye.